Hello, and welcome to the final webcast of Dynamic Range Day 2022. I have to say, I'm somewhat exhausted. Um, it seems like there's a ton of people getting involved today. I just looked at the Facebook page stats. There's over 30,000 engagements already, which is insane. So thank you so much for sharing and spreading the word. If you can see this on YouTube and Facebook, please leave a comment below telling me where you are so that I can say hello. I can see that Ray is here already. Mono Theory says he's here for the memes. That's cool. I think my meme action has been quite strong today. I hope you guys agree. Zed Perps says hi. Pablo says hello. Great to see so many people here. And yeah, there's actually a ton to get through. Lee says hi from Gloucester. Joseph says greetings from Akron, Ohio. Nice. This is where I start to show my lack of knowledge of the acronyms for the US states. Murray, hi from Sydney. Dynamic Range Day is a truly international event. Norberto in Mexico. Great to see you again, Norberto. I went to visit Norberto in 2013, maybe 2012, something like that. He spoke to the AES there, and they invited me to do a speech in Mexico City. I got to meet him and his beautiful family. I went to the audio school that I've now forgotten the name of. It was a great trip. Loved it. Met Steve Lillywhite. Good memories. Ian Booth, hi from Montreal. J-Rel, Oklahoma. Emilio, hi from Mexico. Bjorn says hello from Norway. Fantastic. Thank you all for being here. Please also, if you have a moment, share the post or the page that you're seeing this video on, if you think people that you're connected to might be interested. Ed says hi from Dorset, and OEMS, hello from Mexico too. I must have hit the sweet spot for the time difference in Mexico, maybe. So what am I going to be talking about this evening? Well, if you saw my introduction video at the beginning of the day here in the UK, then you'll know I've kind of got three headline points that I want to go through, and I'll bring up my notes so I don't forget them. The first one is I'm going to tell you why, according to my calculations, 90% of the internet in terms of music streaming audience is hearing it normalized, which means that only 10% of people are hearing music at its original loudness. The loud stuff is getting turned down. I think that's a really persuasive fact for anybody who's kind of concerned about feeling they need to compete in the loudness wars. I'm going to talk to you about Dolby Atmos and how it has changed the rules. I had a fantastic talk earlier on today with Justin Gray from Immersive Mastering. If you want to see the replays of these, you can head over to dynamicrangeday.com and click the live button. There's a link to it right at the top of the front page, or in the menu, there's a live button, and you can see this webcast and the others from today as well, or they're shared on the Facebook page. And I'm going to be talking to you about changes that Apple have made recently that are hugely important on their own, but almost even more important when you compare them with the fact that Apple Spatial now supports Dolby Atmos. And then we're going to announce the winner of the award this year. So lots to get through. Let's start by talking about those statistics. So one of the big objections that I get to, back in the day, I would try and persuade people that loudness was a good idea, and I'd get stonewalled because it's, well, yeah, but if it goes in a CD changer, or if people put my CD on after another, then if it's not as loud, it's not going to sound as powerful, it's not going to stand out. I risk being overlooked, or people thinking that the music doesn't sound as good. Charlie from Boston, hi. And Sigurdur in, I forget, either Denmark or Norway, but originally from Iceland. Thank you for being here, guys. So yeah, the big objection is that on CD or digital files, it's important to be loud. And all of that changed when normalization started to come online, because people were discovering music online, they were listening to music online, and when a super loud file is going to be turned down, then that argument for loudness is much, much less persuasive. However, lots of people correctly point out that it didn't used to be enabled by default on Apple Music. It didn't used to be enabled by default in Spotify, maybe even. And even now, when it is enabled by default in Spotify, and it's enabled by default in Tidal and Amazon Music, and it's there all the time on YouTube, it is still possible to turn it off. And people are still concerned about those situations where people don't hear normalized audio. I just got curious. I was like, well, exactly how many people is that? That I have this unconfirmed figure that only 17% of Spotify users ever touch the normalization settings, which means that 83% of people are listening with normalization enabled on its default settings. I wish I could get official confirmation of that, but I haven't had it. But I started to have a hunt around, and I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see what I found, which was this post on the Musical.ly website. How many users do Spotify, Apple Music, and other streaming services have? And actually, I will share the URL for that in the chat if you guys want to check it out now. I'll just paste that in the comments there. And it's an interesting article. It goes through, I mean, there are problems. There are differences in the times that different platforms are reporting their figures. There are distinctions made between paid subscribers and actual subscribers or users. So it's not clear cut. But what I did is at the end here, there's a really useful pie chart that shows us. So these statistics come from Media Research. The website says, which regularly updates its estimates both on the global subscriber total and the shares of individual services. These figures come from the end of the first quarter of 2021. So they're about a year out of date at this point. And what we're seeing is 32% of the user base is Spotify, 16%, which is normalized by default. 16% is Apple Music, which isn't or used not to be normalized. More on that in a minute. Amazon Music, which is normalized by default. Tencent, I don't know about that. That's not a platform I'm aware of. Google, I'm not sure. I think Google there must mean YouTube Music. And then we have Pandora and Deezer and the others. So being me, I decided to put these numbers into a spreadsheet. And there it is. So I jumped ahead a stage. Back underneath this, they then used these figures, these percentage figures that Media had collected to come up with estimated user numbers for each of the streaming services. So I copied those numbers across into a spreadsheet, which you can see here. And I've made a note whether those platforms are normalized or not. And what we can see is that the biggest share of the global music user base is Spotify with 36%. Apple is next with 18%. Then we have Amazon Music. YouTube Music is only 11%. We come up with 435 million users worldwide based on these figures. And of those, I just added an equation here. You can see I've taken the services that are normalized, because not all of them are. And out of that, 224 million users are probably listening with loudness normalization on. I kind of ignored the fact that a certain number of Spotify users will disable it. You could argue with that, but I don't have an accurate way to reflect that for each service. But for example, we have Apple don't have normalization. I've assumed that none of the others do. Some of them might do. I believe YouTube Music doesn't. In fact, that's incorrect. Deezer does have normalization enabled. So I should just modify this now. I need to add in Deezer. So what we come up with there is, and then I take a percentage of that. I just, based on these two numbers here, we can see that 54% of all of those streaming services are normalized. And that doesn't support my argument at all, because I mentioned something about 90%. These numbers are showing that only 54%. And based on that, you've got a 50-50 chance of whether somebody hears something normalized or not. You know, that's the kind of thing where I would say, yeah, that, you know, that's a fairly persuasive point. However, there is an elephant in the room that we haven't yet taken into account. And that elephant is not YouTube Music, their music subscriber service, but YouTube Video. Because YouTube tell us that on their video sharing platform, on the YouTube platform itself, the number of people watching music videos is in excess of 2 billion. So 4 times as many people are watching music on YouTube's video platform than on all the other streaming services combined, according to these figures. And that changes the situation considerably. That means that 82% of online music streams are coming from YouTube, and YouTube video is always normalized. It can't be disabled. And that means when I did this, originally I did the maths by hand, and I clearly made a mistake because I came up with 89%. But according to this spreadsheet, 92% of the music that people listen to online at the end of the first quarter of 2020-21 was normalized. That's a fairly rough and ready way to figure this stuff out. So I expect some kickback and some criticism of that, and I will welcome it, and I will look at these figures and try and get them more accurate in future. But I find that pretty persuasive, and maybe you would like to offer that to maybe your clients or your friends who are producing albums, or let bands that you follow know that you think if they want to start experimenting with more dynamic music mastering, it's safe for them to do so. So there you go. That is the point number 1 that I wanted to pass on to you, dealt with. Let me just end the screen share there. And I'm going to refer back to that 90% figure from time to time, as I guess you can imagine. So the next point that I wanted to talk about this evening is Dolby Atmos. There simply isn't time in this webcast to even scratch the surface of the topic of Dolby Atmos. I have an interview coming up, which you may like to listen to, where it gets discussed a little bit more. Earlier on today, I did that video with Justin from Immersive Mastering, where we dig into it in quite a bit of depth. And the last episode of the Mastering Show podcast at themasteringshow.com was more of a deep dive into the whole topic of Dolby Atmos. But in a nutshell, because Atmos is an immersive surround format that will play back both on earbuds, but also potentially in a cinema with 20 or 30 speakers, and certainly is designed to play back on systems with 14 speakers in a home environment for people who have home cinema or have invested, and also on soundbars and all the rest of it, all from the same file. In order to have the flexibility to repurpose that audio for all of those different playback configurations, and not knowing in advance how the user is going to play that music back, Dolby Atmos has a built-in headroom of, well, the specification recommends that the loudest material should be mastered at -18 LUFS. I'm sure if you're watching this, you know what LUFS is by now, loudness units full scale. Even if you don't, if I tell you that quite a bit of material that is at the top of the streaming charts at the moment in stereo is at -8 LUFS, so the standard for Atmos is 10 dBs lower than that, that gives you an idea of how much extra space there is in the Atmos format for dynamics. And we dig into that topic in a lot more detail in the interview that I did earlier today. So head over to dynamicrangeday.com, click the live menu item, and you can watch the replay of that there if you want to find out more about this topic. The reason that I'm excited about this is the dynamics, because Atmos is a surround format, but it can also be listened to on Apple earbuds. Anybody with an iOS device pretty much can listen to Atmos. And when they do, they're hearing a much more dynamic version of the music than they might otherwise do. And I just think that is fantastic. A, because those mixes, to me, not all Atmos mixes translate well to binaural. So, you know, that has to be said, but a great number of them do. And when they do, I mean, you can test this for yourself on your iPhone. You swipe down to get the control center, long click on the volume control with Apple earbuds in, and you can toggle spatial audio, which is Apple's implementation of this, on and off. And when you toggle it off, you will hear the stereo version. When you toggle it on, you will hear a binaural render, which just means optimized for listening on earbuds, of the Atmos mix with all of those extra dynamics. And the difference can be quite startling in some cases. And this is so much the case that actually, as you will see in a little while, there are 5 albums nominated for the Dynamic Range Day Award this year. Those are specifically the Atmos mixes of those albums. The stereo masters of those albums are much less dynamic, and there's no way they would normally qualify for the award. But when you listen to the Atmos mixes, masters in binaural, they sound fabulously dynamic. So I'm very excited about that. I can see a comment there about concerns with Atmos mixes. I think maybe we'll dig into that in the Q&A at the end of this. So stick around. I'm hoping perhaps that Mike from Metropolis may be able to join me and help with the Q&A, because he's actually mastering Atmos for real, possibly as we speak. So he will be able to, I mean, I think I know the answer to these questions, but he will be able to confirm that. And I'll just say, Mike says he's here. Great. We'll see Mike towards the end. And J-Rel, just to kind of quickly reply to that comment, you're saying a lot of the Atmos mixes sound worse than the original. I would have agreed with that back when Apple first launched the service, but they have updated the binaural rendering system since then, and that has made a lot of things that sounded bad then sound better now. And I have to say, the majority, especially of recent releases that I'm hearing, I think the Atmos mixes are sounding are in really good shape. In my experience, is a bit more of a lottery if you go to classic material that has been repurposed or reinterpreted for Atmos. But yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think more of them sound good than not these days. Anyway, for my purposes, it perfectly proves the point. I've been saying for years, you guys know it if you've seen the Dynamic Range Day before, you don't need to master it insanely high levels to get a dense, pressured, intense, aggressive sound, if that's what your genre needs. That people tell me all the time, oh, you need to go for that peak level crush in order to get the sound. I've always been saying, I'm not sure that that's really true. And that these Atmos mixes prove it. The good ones demonstrate that you can absolutely get the sound that you're looking for with extra dynamics. So I'm very excited about Dolby Atmos. And finally, I mentioned some changes at Apple that have happened only recently. And in fact, I published a blog post on the Meter Plugs website today, which I shared on social media to explain this in more detail. But briefly, there are 2 major changes to tell you about. The first is that Apple has finally switched over to using LUFS for their loudness normalization. So if you've been paying attention to this issue for a while, you'll know that Spotify, Tidal, YouTube, Amazon all use LUFS, loudness units full scale. It's international standard, which, whether you think it's good or not, at least is predictable, at least is consistent. You can easily test what is you do your master, and then you say, okay, now how's that going to sound at -14 when everything else is at -14 as well? You can do that comparison, or you could use the loudness penalty website and make sure that you're happy with the way that it sounds, and potentially experiment with more dynamic versions to see whether you can get it to sound even better. Apple was the remaining wild card in that bunch. They used a lower level of -16, which is not the end of the world, but their sound check algorithm was quirky, to say the least. You could get differences of 2, 3, sometimes as much as 5 or 6 dBs difference between that and the LUFS figure. But Apple have switched to LUFS, so now things are getting easier. You go to loudness penalty these days, and quite a few of the numbers are the same because they're all using LUFS, and that's great news for everybody who wants to understand how normalization is going to work. Normalization is a good thing, but it's a pain in the neck to figure out, right? It's counterintuitive, it's confusing, and it used to be very, very complicated in terms of all the different streaming platforms. But now we have this consistency between all the platforms. They're all using LUFS, which is a great move. The other change that Apple have made that I think is possibly even more significant is that as of now, all new Apple devices will have soundcheck enabled by default. And that means that going forward, we as mastering engineers, music producers, can be confident. Not only do you have that 90% of online music, but virtually all devices are going to normalize by default. YouTube is always normalized. Spotify is normalized by default. Tidal is normalized by default. Now, finally, Apple Music is normalized by default. So I genuinely don't think there's any reason for anybody to be concerned that, oh, obviously, some people are going to disable normalization and they will then hear the loudness variations. But if someone knows that this is happening and chooses to go into the settings and disable it, chances are they understand the consequences of that. And that kind of educated user, I don't think is going to be bothered by differences in loudness. They're just going to go, oh, there you go. That's because I've got normalization off. Most people have no idea that those settings exist, don't care. I mean, users don't care about loudness anyway. We know this. There's research. It's on the research page of the Dynamic Range Day website. But so I think this is a hugely positive step. And when you bring those two factors together, Apple supporting Dolby Atmos and having soundcheck enabled by default, then I think you get something very powerful, which is people are going to be hearing Atmos mixes with soundcheck enabled most of the time, or whenever an Atmos mix is available by default. So they're going to be hearing these dynamic mixes, these versions in Atmos that have maybe 8 to 10 dBs more peak headroom. And in my experience, they're going to love them. My personal theory is that a huge part of the pleasure that people get from the Atmos format is not only the spatial thing, because not many people actually have multiple speaker setups and all the rest of it. It's to do with the dynamics. It's the bass having room to breathe. It's the lack of distortion. It's the lack of unnecessary crush. That's my opinion. I think if you're watching this event, you probably agree with me. So I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I'm really excited about the fact that all of these things have happened at this time. I see the potential. My hope is that people will hear and enjoy dynamic mixes via Atmos and will be experimenting with those more and more. I also think it's super important that there's education needing to happen at the record labels, right? When a record label first decide to have their Atmos mixes done and they come back quieter, they're going to say, why are these so much quieter? And there's going to have to be a conversation with the mastering engineer. It's going to be, well, it's in the specification for the deliverables. This is the recommended level. You know, if we push it much harder than this, it's going to cause the decoder to start limiting, which isn't going to sound good. If you want the best results, this is where it needs to be. And then there's going to be this, oh, okay, no, I'm not that happy about that. But then the mastering engineer can provide them with loudness matched examples, and they can just go on that journey to discover the stuff that we already know, which is that the dynamic stuff sounds just as good and often better. So that covers all of those things. Oh, and by the way, the loudness penalty website is completely updated to reflect, we've kept the original soundcheck values for soundcheck for Apple for the time being. So you'll see if you go to loudness penalty now, it says Apple and then Apple Legacy. That's the old value. So because this applies to new devices with the latest version of the OS, for me on my Mac, which still has Mojave installed, and I know lots of musicians don't update their Macs straight away, iTunes is still using the old loudness, the old soundcheck values. So we've kept that value on the website so you don't get any unexpected results. And if you see a big difference, then that's probably something you want to look into anyway. The plugin is also updated. If you're a loudness penalty plugin user, you can head over to meterplugs/download, enter your email address and get the latest version now. And if you're not yet a loudness penalty plugin user and you would like to be, to celebrate Dynamic Range Day, it is on sale for the next week, 30% off. Just head over to meterplugs.com to get your copy. So now we get to the Dynamic Range Day Award. And as I mentioned, I might share my screen again with you so that you can see the list of the short list of nominees. I have so many browser windows open. There we go. So this year's shortlist: Silk Sonic, Uptown Funk Guy, Bruno Mars does it again. That's a fantastic album. It's quite retro, but I love it. King Buffalo, aggressive, kind of heavy, progressive stuff. Dirty Loops, Turbo, Kate Havnevik, Lightship, Reindeer, Obsidian Silk. That album is fantastic, kind of, I guess, somewhat industrial maybe. It's kind of electronica, techno-y influenced, very interesting. And I think overall about -14 LUFS sounds huge on YouTube. Marillion, An Hour Before It's Dark. The Burial album is super dynamic because it's very ambient. But the Bonobo album, also Fragments, is fantastically dynamic. I really recommend you take a listen to these albums. I would say that several of them, for example, Marillion and the Kate Havnevik album, the two that spring to mind, do have some moments on them where things do get pretty intense and crushed. I debated whether to include those in the list, and I decided that I would. Overall, all of these albums are -11 LUFS or lower, and as an overall value for an album with a load of variety in it, that means there are great dynamics. There are some moments, short moments, where everything gets a bit squashed for my taste, but overall, I think they make for a fantastic listen. So I recommend you check them out. And the Dolby Atmos specific mixes that we have here at Masters, the Dua Lipa album, Future Nostalgia. I've bent the rules because the Atmos version came out this year. The album itself came from last year. I chose that just because the Stereo Masters are hot. That is a really loud album. But the Atmos version is not insanely loud. It sounds fantastic. It still sounds like Dua Lipa. Lil Nas X, Montero, the stereo master of that is really loud, but the Atmos version sounds amazing. The Lord album, Solar Power, didn't need to be that loud. It's quite folky, quite sort of 70s style in places. You know, it's not the kind of, you could argue that maybe her earlier albums needed, there's that word again, a more dense, crushed sound. I don't buy it. I would, all of these albums, I would choose to listen to the Atmos version on my iPhone because of the dynamics. The Billie Eilish album, Happier Than Ever, sounds fantastic in Atmos, and so unnecessarily loud, in my opinion, on the stereo. You know, listen for yourself, see what you think, and when people start talking to you about albums that need dynamics, offer them these as examples. And Olivia Rodrigo, Sour, that's another album. I mean, the Atmos version is still really aggressive, really dense, really distorted, just like the stereo version, but with all that extra headroom to breathe in, and just sounds fantastic. So I'm moving through this quickly because I have a 20-minute interview to play you with the engineer who mixed and mastered the winning album. And I wanted to have time for you to listen to that. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here for the actual webcast, but I was very happy to be able to record that interview. And I think there's a load of information in there that you guys will be really interested in, and a lot of, you know, positivity along the similar lines that I'm talking about. So without further ado, I can announce that this year's winner of the Dynamic Range Day Award is the Dolby Atmos version of Happier Than Ever by Billie Eilish. It's one of my favorite albums of the last 12 months. It sounds fantastic. It suits the material perfectly. As I say, I would always choose to listen to the Atmos version of this album, even on earbuds. And now I will play you the interview with Nick Rives, who is the engineer from Capitol, who mixed and mastered the album. and we can talk about all this. This is an edited version of the whole interview. I will put up the whole interview maybe as a separate upload and share it in future if you guys would like to hear that. So here we go. I hope you enjoy it. Nick, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
And of course, the reason you're here is that you mixed the Atmos version of the new Billie Eilish album, Happier Than Ever. I guess about a year ago, was it now? Is it longer?
Yeah, it's about a year ago now. Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah, excellent. And it is nominated for this year's Dynamic Range Day Award. We've got a few Atmos albums in the lineup this year because they have great dynamics, which is what
Absolutely
today is all about. And I mean, I'm not going to beat about the bush. I'm delighted to say that this album you have won. So congratulations.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That's awesome.
No, my pleasure. I mean, you know, it was kind of, well, I love the album musically.
Totally.
I particularly love the Atmos version of it because I think the immersive format suits the album so well. You know, it just seems like a kind of perfect fit to me in terms of, you know, the kind of moody, atmospheric, you know, it benefits as far as I'm concerned from having that extra space and that room to believe. I mean, to breathe. It must have been great to work on, really good fun.
It was a ton of fun. I mean, I would put it on the short list of the most engaging and satisfying projects that I've ever worked on. For all of the reasons that you mentioned, you know, it's the music is just so perfect. The composition and the layout and the detailing and the performances is just, it's like tailor-made for the format. And so it was just really a lot of fun for me to just stretch out into the space. I make all my decisions based on the composition, so it made everything just felt smooth and natural. And the next thing I knew, I felt like I had this really great experience. So I'm very proud of the work.
No, it's fantastic, and I'd like to get into asking you a few questions about kind of how you work when you're working in Atmos, and specifically how the dynamics of the format kind of influence the way that you do things. And of course, that's the thing that's the reason this album has won the award. We had a few Atmos albums included in the list here. So there was Future Nostalgia by Dua Lipa, Montero by Lil Nas X, Solar Power by Lorde, Sour by Olivia
really
Rodrigo. And
nice.
All of those, for me, when I move, I mean, even listening on earbuds, you know, moving from the stereo into the Atmos, it's all still there, but it's more. And for me, the way that there's more is in the dynamics. And so we'll talk just briefly about the kind of the technical aspects of that, because I know that Dolby strongly recommend, if not require, that the loudest songs should be -18 LUFS. And I know that Universal in particular have taken that to heart. And of course, that's a dramatic difference between stereo stuff, which could easily be -8 or louder, you know. So you're talking 8 to 10 dBs extra headroom. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the reason for that is largely practical. If you have this virtual mix effectively in the Atmos format that can translate to 20 speakers, or even in the most humble situations, kind of 10 or 12 speakers, and also translate down onto earbuds, in order just to have the processing flexibility to be able to combine all of those elements without causing problems, you need the extra headroom. Is that an accurate way of describing it?
Yes, that is the most practical way to approach that change in deliverable spec, right? Is that, you know, you're creating a virtual mix that needs to conform itself to whatever shape it ends up, you know, being rendered out of, whether that's headphones or a movie theater, right? If you're in a movie theater with 64 speakers, that can do a certain energy dispersion pattern, whereas headphones, it's going to be a radically different one, or, you know, a 5-1 system or a sound bar, right? Like the I don't want to say limitations, but the constraints of any given playback system need to be adhered to, but we're only making the one mix. I'm only delivering the one file. So by creating that headroom, it allows us to better access the widest range of playback environments with the greatest level of consistency in terms of the way that energy is compiled, and freeing us of the constraints of like hitting a hard limiter or the possibility of distortion. Now, like I am not the best expert on loudness, but I deal with it in a practical way every day, right? So like let's talk about that -18 LUFS integrated concept, right? Integrated LUFS is a very relative sense of loudness and energy. And what do I mean by that? You know, a big band or an EDM track or like a Beck tune with 90 million, you know, different instruments at, you know, coming out of every, you know, place in the room at -18 will yield one perceived loudness that might be different than a vocal and an acoustic guitar that also is at -18. That will be substantially louder perceived energy than the super dense, hyper busy track, you know. And that's what's great about LUFS, but it's also what's challenging about LUFS sometimes, you know. And so what we do is, you know, we try and mix in album format as one does, right? You know, so you've got 8, 10, 20 tracks. And as you go through that album, it's of course an ebb and flow of experiences. I mean, some albums are, you know, 10 singles, and some albums have interludes and orchestral breakdowns, and, you know, I mean, it's the wonderful diversity of music. So, you know, it is our role to create an experience that has continuity from top to bottom, and therefore it's nice to have a guideline like where LUFS should end up as a limiting point, not limiting as in dynamic range limiting, but like, you know, okay, there's what we'll consider our loudest, you know, place in this experience is going to be a track that integrated gives us -18 LUFS, and every other track on the record can kind of be balanced against that to create that continuum. And what I generally suggest and what I do personally is, you know, I just bring down the other tracks to create that continuous experience. And sometimes that can be a challenge, absolutely. And sometimes it can yield a fantastically theatrical result where, you know, you've got these intimate verses and these intimate tracks, and then these bombastic, chaotic tracks that are full of energy and life. And that dynamic experience is thoroughly satisfying as the listener. You know, we get that experience when we go to live shows. We get that experience when you're in a room with a band. It's the way it feels when you're playing in a band. And it's a wonderful way to experience music when you have the opportunity to. So I'm very grateful for the opportunities that Atmos gives us to explore that dynamic range. You know, I mean, 18 LUFS integrated still has plenty of opportunity for things to get loud and things to get quiet. You know, we're talking about the Billy record. So the title track, Happier Than Ever, I think is a perfect example of this. The first 2/3 of that, you know, that track's perfectly thirds. And, you know, the first third is like very intimate and very, you know, kind of, there's an atmosphere to it, but there's really this kind of intimate storytelling going on in that way that Billie Eilish is so incredibly good at, right? Her voice just brings you into this, like you feel like it's almost, you almost get nervous at how intimate you are. And then there's this middle third transition period where we start getting these like electric guitars show up. They kind of creep in and there's this nice effect. And then it brings us to this moment with these palm mutes. And it's like, okay, like musically our energy is exciting. We've stepped up a level, you know, and the vocal gets a little bit larger, a little bit more impactful. And then we hit this back third that is just absolutely, you know, pedal to the metal. It is just explosive, crunchy guitars, backbust distorted drums. Like the bass is just thunderous, and she's like screaming over the top of it, or through it, I should say. And it is like kind of the absolute apex of energy output in the entire record. And the narrative of the song is wildly emotional. So that, you know, the stereo mix is awesome, and everything, the fidelity is incredible, and everything sounds, you know, just really good and really locked into a perfect place, and it'll speak on any system. What I was able to explore is the opportunity for it to grow and really hit when it gets to that big moment, and it is like violent. And I think that that's a really fun opportunity to take advantage of what the Atmos format has to offer, what the -18 integrated LUFS deliverable standard has to offer, to really expand upon the expression of that performance and of that composition. You know, like I want to feel like I'm at that stadium and my hair's being blown back. You know, that visceral excitement is in large part due to the opportunity to explore dynamics, and I think that's a really fun and meaningful expression in all music, and Atmos has given us an opportunity to kind of bring that back into what would be a more mainstream consumer experience. You know, I mean, when I think about, like, you know, I had this really great memory as a kid going and seeing Carmina Burana at the San Francisco Symphony, and you know, they just the overture of that piece, So Fortuna, you know, they just dropped the hammer, bar one, beat one, literally. You know, and it's just like explosive sound, and then all of a sudden we're getting real quiet and we're building up, you know. And I mean, I know that's the hallmark of classical music, but it just, like, that was just a memory that really landed with me, the power of, you know, an unamplified performance of, you know, 90 people on stage doing this whole thing, and just like feeling like I'm doing this in my chair and then I'm doing this in my chair, you know. I mean, just really fun you know, experience, and to now be able to bring that to the type of work that I do that's radically outside of that genre is enormously satisfying to me.
Yeah, no, I'll bet. And it's one of the things that's most satisfying for me about these Atmos mixes, because I mean, all of the examples that are on the shortlist this year, you know, if you have an Apple device and want to toggle the spatial audio on and off, so in which case when you turn it, if you're streaming the files, if you switch spatial audio off, it will revert to the original stereo mix. And with sound check, the normalization enabled, there's not a huge difference in the loudness there. So you get a pretty good comparison of the two versions. And what I love about it is that all of the, I mean, the vast majority of those are big, aggressive. I mean, the Dua Lipa album is seriously loud in stereo.
Big time.
But it still works in Atmos. You know, over and over are people telling me, oh no, you need the loudness to achieve the sound. And I've been saying, do we though? You know, it's like, maybe it's harder to achieve that intensity and that pressure if you're not slamming it right up against the top of the scale, you know. But it's just a question. I mean, it's gain staging, and it's so. Totally. And the Atmos mixes, I think, prove the point. And my hope is that with more people listening to them and experimenting with them, they're gonna hear that and they're gonna realize that one of the things they love about Atmos is the extra dynamics, and maybe that will allow more artists and more labels to kind of feel like, okay, well, we could experiment with that in the stereo versions as well, you know, and we could bring some of that cinematic kind of feel back to the stereo format, because it's absolutely possible there. You know, you don't have the spatial elements, you don't have the height and the surround aspects, but we could be using all of that dynamics there and still get the sound for all of these genres. I guess you'd agree with that.
I totally agree with that. Absolutely. And I would say that has manifested itself in my own work. If I'm mixing in stereo, I think in a more dynamic way than I used to, you know. I think, you know, we exist in this kind of post limitation environment of consumer formats. You know, we gotten very used to a very loud presentation of our stereo music, and it's easy to get very comfortable with that because, you know, we're naturally inclined to perceive louder as better. Or at least, you know, it's the knee-jerk reaction of comparing things, that whichever version is louder is likely to be the one that we'll gravitate towards. I'm not saying all the time, but as a general rule, people tend to react that way. And you know, I don't think that the nature of the way we're consuming music necessarily needs to be limited by that, you know, by the necessity of hitting a certain loudness target. And I think that freedom should offer us the opportunity to explore more dynamic experiences in any format of music consumption. And I'm cautiously optimistic that because Atmos so natively gives us that opportunity, that it will allow us as a community of creators to kind of, you know, explore that in every of our expressions, you know, and I would love to see that happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Completely agree. Okay. So, it's great that you're here. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I am curious to find out, what kind of reaction you get from artists and labels when they hear the Atmos mixes. I have to ask, whether are you being put under pressure to make things louder, and how does that work out? But I'm guessing people really appreciate and love. Everybody I speak to in Atmos tells me that artists in particular love the sound when they get the chance to hear it.
The overwhelming experience that I have when putting artists and creators in front, in the room, in the right spot, and hitting play is positive. People love it. They can explore things about their own compositions that, maybe had to be sacrificed in order for the greater good of the stereo experience. There's all these opportunities for like fidelity and intelligibility of complex arrangements. I did this War on Drugs record, and their compositional style often is layering tons of different voices that are doing a very similar musical or harmonic expression. And I'm like, great, I'll spread that out, and we can explore all of those different textures in a meaningful way while also getting the aggregate experience of the original composition. And when playing it back for the mix engineer and the artist himself, we had a ton of fun exploring those things, and remember, oh yeah, well, that's right, we doubled that on the Jupiter, and oh yeah, we did, and it was just like all of these cool things that get to kind of unfold in the Atmos playback environment, which is great. To your point about pressure for loudness, by and large, no, I'm not really under any pressure for that. I will say, however, that it is something that is part of my workflow. I do pay attention to the feeling of the energy transfer that I'm getting from the stereo, and I will employ mix techniques to match those in different ways with my Atmos mix, with my stems, and with just regular mixing prowess, right? Parallels, dynamic interchange, all of just kind of our regular techniques and some new techniques that are specific to the format. But I've had conversations with mix engineers where they're like, yeah, but there's no mix bus. So like, I don't know how to get that thing. And it's like, I get you. And I didn't either. But then I figured out a way to do it in a compelling and different way. Like, is it the same? No, but the same isn't the job. The same is something different and new, So like, it's called engineering, right? Engineer your way into a solution, utilize all of the resources available to you, all of your experiences and your critical judgment, and you can create a mix that reads as a very loud and bombastic experience when it needs to, and intimate and open and spacious when not, and I think that's definitely part of the gig. It's like, yes, sure, it's easy to slap a compressor or a limiter on a mix bus at the end of the day. I mean, I don't mean to undermine that in and of itself is an incredible art form, but it's more complicated to achieve a similar thing in the way object-based mixing in Atmos works. And while that is a challenge, it's not impossible to deal with. We identify what it is about those interchanges that are important, and then figure out a way to create those and without compromising the expression that you're trying to get out of Atmos. Rock and roll is a very sensitive genre for this exact conversation, right? The relationship between the kick drum and the rhythm guitar is wildly important in any modern rock and roll presentation, whether it's alt rock or metal, doesn't matter. Like this is rock and roll. And so, we have to go to great lengths to create that experience in Atmos while not curbing our ability to express what's important about Atmos, because you also don't want 20 speakers blasting crazy limited data, because that's just super fatiguing, and it's a difficult, you get tired, your brain gets tired, it shuts down. So many different parts of your brain are working when listening in Atmos or any immersive format compared to stereo, because it's engaging you in so many different vectors that it triggers all of these other parts of your brain, and therefore it can be fatiguing. So we need to be sensitive to that and explore ways in which we can find a nice a happy medium where we got great energy transfer and open, dynamic, compelling, immersive experience. And so while it's easy to be like, yes, we can be louder, we can be quieter, we can do all of this great stuff, there is a certain necessity to making sure that the feeling of the music matches what's so critical about the identity as it exists in stereo. So while nobody's telling me make it loud, I'm making sure that I'm getting that perceived energy to where it's supposed to be so that it feels loud, even if it's coming in at -18. And then my other, kind of flip side consumer facing argument to there is that, like, no matter what device you're using, it may only have one button or knob on it, and I guarantee you that that is the volume, and sometimes you got to reach for it. You know what I mean? I think Soundcheck is a great implementation of an automated volume, because it's not a compressor, it's just turning things up and down. And I think that's great. I think that being aware of your environment and being aware of which experience would likely be better for you under those circumstances is also relevant, like for the same reason that, if you're watching a movie on a TV with speakers built into a TV, you might want to use a reduced dynamic range feature. If you're on a home theater system, you would then not want to use a reduced dynamic range feature because you've got the headroom and you've got a device that's capable of putting out that level of sensitivity, right? So it's like, for those of us who are engaged in the experience, I think there's a wealth of opportunities to explore how to make it optimized for what we want and what we need. And so knowing that that's true, when I'm in the studio, I just try and serve the art to the best of my ability.
Fantastic. Well, listen, congratulations. It's an amazing album. The Atmos version is amazing. I love it. Thanks again for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate that insight into how you work and the opportunities of the Atmos format. I'm looking forward to hearing what you do next.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. And thank you so much for the award. I'm very appreciative of it. I was very proud of that record. And so to be able to have a conversation about it is very satisfying for me. So thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Nick. Cheers.
Cool. All right, man.
So, unmutes Mike. There you go. Much too dynamic. I hope you've enjoyed that, found it useful and interesting. I certainly enjoyed talking to Nick. There is more of that conversation, which, as I say, maybe I will upload as a separate video. And that brings us to the end of the presentation part of Dynamic Range Day. I mean, my goal with the award is always to choose a really mainstream album because I want to show that, for example, if I choose a Steven Wilson album, and he was nominated last year, of course, that's fantastic, but he's very much a niche. People were suggesting the Neil Young album. I could do that, but people are going to say, well, of course, Neil Young is dynamic, right? But for Dua Lipa to sound amazing, dynamic, for Lorde to sound amazing, for Lil Nas X to sound amazing, for all of these artists to sound amazing with extra dynamics in the mix and in the master, and for them to sound right, nobody's going to listen to those Atmos binaural versions and think that's weird. That doesn't sound like I expect it. They might think it sounds a little bit different, but they're going to think it sounds cool. And so for me, it's all about getting the message out. There's a lot of interesting discussion going on in the comments about the pros and cons of Atmos as a music delivery format, whether it's well supported on this device or that, whether binaural mixes in general sound good or not. And by the way, in my experience, it depends entirely on the mix. And actually, Mike, if you're listening, if you want to click through so you can join in the conversation, maybe we can address some of these comments because we're going to do a Q&A now because it's traditional. I have my whiskey complete with James Bond style aluminium ice cube. Keeps the drink cold but doesn't dilute the whiskey, see? Excellent. I can see Mike has arrived. Anyway, if you're not interested in the Q&A, then thanks for watching. If you are, then please feel free to drop questions and comments into the chat and we will do our best to work on it. So let me bring Mike in. Excellent. There you are.
Evening, Ian.
How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, very well.
Excellent. And I'm sure people here probably already know you, but if not, Mike is a mastering engineer at Metropolis, which is one of the two, I would say, major mastering studios in London here in the UK. They have what they claim, at least, is the country's most advanced Atmos room, 9.2 1.6 or 9.2.6?
11.2.8.
Oh, for heaven's sake. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And
Look,
yeah,
you've got to put the numbers in if you're going to make the boast.
Yeah, fair enough. And yeah, Mike is working daily with Atmos, both, well, he was my guest on the Mastering Show podcast last month. So we will try not to retread too much of the ground there, but we had an interesting conversation between him and Emre. You know, one of the problems with Atmos is, what do you call things when is it mixing? Is it mastering? Because the lines get blurred. But anyway, creating music for the Atmos format. I mean, Mike, since you're here, how do you feel about your Atmos work listening back in binaural, be it on, via Tidal on an Android phone or via Apple? Do you agree with me that the stuff still comes across well and that the dynamics are a benefit?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really enjoying listening to not just my own work, but obviously other people's work. I haven't listened to the Billie Eilish yet, so I'm obviously going to have to make a point of listening to that tomorrow, on my way into work again. But I'm doing a lot of listening on binaurals. Binaural it's just super important. It's what everyone's going to be listening to Atmos on, at least for the next few years, if not the foreseeable future. I'm checking things on on the AirPods that I'm wearing now, on Sony cans, on more expensive, the Odyssey type headphones, on the Apple AirPods Max, some Sennheiser headphones that we've got in the studio as well. So we've got like a whole selection of different headphones that we're checking things on. We are checking the kind of official Dolby binaural render as well as the Apple spatial render. It's mostly, from our point of view, just a kind of check phase, like make sure it is translating, nothing's too weird. There's an acceptance that all of those can change at any point. So you don't want to do too much work focusing on just that, because if you're like, oh well, the binaural sounds close to good enough, but there's a little problem at 2K on the vocal, in which case you probably put it to the near setting rather than the mid setting or off. But you're just going to kind of go, yeah, it is what it is. That's what the binaural does to the thing, and move on, as long as it's just a kind of little tiny detail that it's not there in the main room version.
Yeah, it's excellent. I'm seeing a comment here from people asking what the War on Drugs album that Nick mastered was, and I don't know off the top of my head. Somebody else was asking about credits. I'm going to go to discogs.com, which is an excellent site for finding out the credits on things.
Not for Atmos.
Not for Atmos?
No, because there's no physical release.
Oh, okay.
Discogs is a physical release site. This is a thing I've been having. Jackster, and there's another one that I've got on the phone. Can't remember the name of. Muso.ai.
Okay.
Are starting to put things up for Atmos credits, but it's very early days, and most of the time they're putting them up because I'm emailing them and saying, "Oi, you've not got any of my credits here."
Oh, that's a shame. Okay, well, you guys, I will attempt to find out, and I will post. It's possible that the Atmos version isn't out yet. I'm not sure when Nick mentioned that he was working on that. So, yeah, if I can find that out for you, I will let you know. So feel free, anybody, to ask any questions of Mike and I just about dynamics and mastering in general. It doesn't have to be Atmos related. Oh, one of the users is saying that Discogs also lists digital files releases. I guess, I mean, one of the things is, I think Discogs is based on user submissions, right?
Yes, but also digital file submissions. Atmos doesn't have a digital file. There's not a physical. There's not. I guess you're not physically downloading an MP3, but there's not a file that hits your computer. It's a streaming thing. So yeah, as of yet, I've yet to see any Atmos credits on Discogs.
Well, hopefully that will change in future. So we must have answered all the questions. Usually we have a bunch of questions coming in, but this is good. Maybe I'm going to go to bed early. What do you guys want us to talk about, if anything? Yeah, I was going to say, please do, if you're watching this, check out all of those nominees for the Dynamic Range Day Award. They all sound fantastic. They're all, there's a huge range of genres in there. And also take a look back through past years at previous winners, because, there are some major releases there that have been released with a ton of dynamics. I can see a few more comments coming in now. Let's take a look at these. So Eric says, what are your thoughts on dynamic range and car listening while driving, road noise, wind noise, etc.? I mean, that's a tough one. My car is noisy, and I put up with it. I mean, because I'm not comfortable having noise cancellation on in the headphones when I'm driving. I feel like, it's probably still safe, but I use my ears a lot when I'm driving. I've diagnosed more faults in my car months before the engineers have been able to find it by listening to it, or just by kind of hearing something that sounds wrong that I care to mention. So yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. I mean, but I think my feeling about, I guess what you're asking there, Eric, is whether reduced dynamic range will work better in a noisy environment like a car or a tube subway, or a noisy street. And my feelings about that are the same as they are for club listening. People often use the fact that artists and DJs especially want everything super loud for club playback. And I kind of feel like, well, those are very specific use cases. I don't feel like we should penalize everybody else listening to music everywhere for the sake of those two situations. So, it is a challenge. But I think for me, it's like if I'm not doing something active where I need to be able to hear, I just use noise cancelling, or even just in-ear headphones that block out sufficient noise. I think that's a better solution, because the other thing that I would say is, in my experience, crushing the dynamic range right down doesn't actually help in noisy environments. I mean, maybe it enables you to turn it up a bit louder without causing yourself pain. But actually, in some ways, I think dynamic music kind of works better if you've got a constant noise in the background. The fact that there's some variety in there, if the music is also a wall of sound, it's just a question of, two blending together. Mike, what do you do when you're on the tube in London?
Well, on the tube, that's easy. It's noise cancelling headphones. But is the car thing not a red herring? Because my first car just had a cassette deck, and most of those old cassettes, that I was listening to back then, were not mastered loud, and I didn't have a problem hearing, those old records back then. It was never an issue, so I don't see why it would be an issue now, just because I can get it louder and more squashed.
No, I mean, I think so. One recent example is from the first Billie Eilish album, the tune Zanny. That caught lots of attention because of the heavy distorted bass in the chorus, which was completely intentional and not a mastering problem. A question people often ask me is, well, what's a typical difference in loudness between sections of a song, verse and chorus? And I always say it depends on the material. But if you're going to put a gun to my head, I would say anywhere, but maybe 4 dB. Is probably about right. Could be lower, could be 3 or 2, depending on what the material is. Maybe could be a bit wider. But 4 dB difference for me, as a kind of, just as a rough idea, is not a bad place to start experimenting and then make a musical decision based on that. I'm pretty sure the Billie Eilish record has 8 to 10 dB difference in loudness between the verse and the chorus. And it doesn't work in my car at all. So the track Zanny, if you crank the vocals up to the point where you can hear her in the kind of whispery vocal verse, when the chorus comes in, I'm in danger of popping the cones on the speakers in my car. And vice versa. If you turn that back down, then when it gets to the verse, it disappears into the road noise. if it was me, I might have been tempted to encourage them to master it with slightly less dynamic contrast than that, which is kind of ironic coming from the guy running Dynamic Range Day. But it's all a question of taste. It's all a question, and I bet they had that conversation, and Billy and Phineas were like, no, we want it. It's got to be like that, because the whole point is for the emotion of the song. You have this contrast and all the rest of it. So yeah, I wouldn't want. I mean, I think another thing is, some cars I think have kind of automatic dynamic range control stuff built into the stereo. I think my general answer is the same as Mike, which is that it's an engineering problem, not an artistic problem. And actually, tracks like Zanny are unusual. Most songs work fine, and you just crank them up a bit. If it gets a bit quiet, it's not the end of the world. What other questions do we have here? Frederick has a very specific Atmos question. How do you process groups and handle beds and objects as a mastering engineer?
Together,
Briefly.
usually. The bed and the objects will be treated in the same way that I would approach a stem master. If one was to be given to me, I'd try and avoid them, but if it were to happen, in that I would just group it all together anyway and process them as a single unit. And in beds and objects, I do exactly that. I don't bus them to a single bus, but I do process them all with the same processing, and I have sidechains set up so that any limiting compression, whatever, is triggered at the same time on every single channel. All my EQs are going to be identical. I use the grouping feature in Pro Tools to just allow that to happen automatically. So it's trying to get a process that is familiar to what we're already used to and the workflows that we already know and are familiar with, and is quick to work because we know exactly how to get the results we want. And the only other thing I would say is that as a result of that, you can end up in a scenario where something that's been brought maybe quite far out from the focus of the music. So if your mix is very wide in the Atmos space, you can end up with some kind of oddities, and at that point you have to kind of dig in a little bit on that specific track, which is again a lot like you would be doing if you were stem mastering, where you would try your best not to do anything to individual stems if you can avoid it, but sometimes you hear and you're like, oh, the bass just needs some work. So yeah, it's largely treating everything as the song as a whole, and occasionally thinking that one thing needs work.
Yep, great. Siegador says, I need a crash course in all this Atmos thing. You need to listen to
tell him to get a flight to London. Come and see me at Metropolis. The invite is open, Siegador. You know you're welcome. Come see me. I'll give you a crash course.
But if you can't afford the flight, then you listen to the last episode of the Mastering Show where Mike was a guest along with Emre, and we went into this in some depth. I also have some YouTube videos for anybody who's interested in that. If you head over to productionadvice.co.uk and search for Atmos, they should pop up. Sigurd says thank you, so it looks like that might be happening.
Yeah, well, I know it sounds kind of glib and that I'm just being a bit silly, but actually, I've spent most of the last 3 days doing exactly that. We've had demo after demo with artists, labels. Yesterday evening, I invited you, Ian, and a whole bunch of the MPG members were invited over to Metropolis, and I gave 4 or 5 different Atmos demos through the day to various people. So yeah, we're really keen as a studio to kind of promote Atmos, and not just in a promoting ourselves kind of way. As the way we kind of see it is, if Atmos does well and Atmos takes off and lots of people are working in Atmos and we've helped that happen, then it will just build up a kind of impression where Metropolis is nice, aren't they? They've helped us along. And it will just, that feeling will pass on throughout. And so we're not kind of being, selfish and being like, oh, I'm not showing you any of my toys. It's like, no, come down, come chat to me. I'll absolutely happily show people what Atmos is, how it works, what's going on, and what techniques so far I've picked up.
That's fantastic. And I have to say that's something that I've found has been really nice about, as soon as I heard about Atmos, I was intrigued and interested. I hadn't really, I knew of it as a cinema thing, but until the Apple launch, it wasn't really on my radar for music. And yeah, almost everybody I've spoken to, there is this huge enthusiasm for it, I think, in the industry right now, which is and seems to be, I wouldn't say necessarily a community, but everybody's helping everybody else out, because everybody wants it to be successful. And that's right. Really nice to hear. We should say at this point, there are other solutions. Atmos is one form of immersive audio. There's Sony 360. There's a DTS version. There's ambisonics. There are all kinds of different ways of doing immersive audio. But Atmos is the one that's got all the buzz because of the huge user base. People asking how to listen to Atmos mixes themselves. If you're on Android, you need Tidal, which is a subscription service, and you need the right kind of Android phone. So Samsung's work, recent Samsung's, but for example, or Amazon Music, correct. Whereas my son's Moto G6, which is only a couple of years ago, doesn't support Atmos because you need the decoder chip in the hardware. And that's the other great thing about what Apple have done, is that the Dolby Digital decoder is there it worked on my iPhone 7 until it kicked the bucket. And that's a pretty old phone at this point, so there's a huge potential user base there, which is another reason that people are so excited about this, I think. Sigurd wants to know, no, you're not using PMCs, are you, Mike? You've got
in the Atmos room, we're not. We're using the Neumann, the old Klein and Hummel design speakers.
Yeah. Mark is asking, outside of the Apple ecosystem, where can one find Atmos source material to listen to? So Amazon Music and Tidal are the two that I know about. Any others that you know of, Mike?
It's the only two I'm aware of at this point. I know we're in constant communication with Spotify, trying to push them to do something with it. And I think it will happen, but they're not official on anything yet. So it'll be a while off. It's been a while trying to launch lossless.
So it's the platform. You need the platform plus the hardware that's capable of decoding it, Mark. So, and this is usual. It's not as true these days that Apple's just work in the way that they used to, in my experience. But in this case, they kind of do. It's like if you have an fairly recent Apple device, you're likely to be able to listen to Atmos on earbuds. Whereas it's less clear cut. Actually, there were some people saying that there were PC solutions for listening to it as well. I'm sure there'll be software on a PC that would enable you to do it. One, I guess, disadvantage of Dolby is that it requires a hardware decoder. I'm not aware of any software decoders for it. Certainly, any decoder needs a license. So I think you're unlikely to find completely free solutions. It's free if you already have an iPhone, or if you're already a Tidal subscriber. But that's the way. Mark says he has the PC app, so he can go to Amazon. Okay, there you go. Somebody else says Dolby Access app on PC. Excellent. Sam, the issue with Atmos is the spatial field is 50% effective because it assumes a theater. This is an issue for heights and also forward and behind perception in binaural. The HRTF will improve. I'm not sure what you mean by the 50%. Oh, I guess what you're saying is, Sam, it's true. So something we didn't get into in the webcast proper, but we do go into in some depth in the podcast episode, is what binaural is. So you're listening to an emulation of something that our ears do naturally. Our brains know how sounds are affected by our ears and our head and our torso, in the same way that we understand how sound is affected by the environment. And because they've been doing it since we were born, they can decode that information. They kind of pick up clues from the sound of the audio coming in to give us ideas where things are. And binaural rendering, as used by Atmos, is faking that basically as best it can. And of course, it can't fake it for your personal head. Somebody in the comments there was saying, I just don't like binaural on my headphones. Personally, I think, it could just be that the headphones aren't great, but if they're a decent pair of headphones, it's equally possible that, just for example, something as simple as how wide your head is, the emulation that's built into Dolby and built into Apple devices is based on some approximations, a kind of average head, in as much as that's a thing, and average ears. What's exciting is there is the potential. In fact, Dolby have released recently a beta version of software that will give you a personalized, it's called the head related transfer function, HRTF. An emulation that is personalized to your head and your ears, which has the potential to make the effect of it much more effective. Was it you I was talking to?
At the moment, that software is only for producers, so it only works if you have the Dolby Atmos Mastering Suite or the Dolby Atmos Production Suite, which is, that's ruling out 99.9% of your consumers. So it's not a consumer-based solution yet. It is in beta. I've tried it out. I did the head scan actually earlier today. So it's improving. They've announced, even within the beta version of the software, that they are going to be continually updating what they're calling the PHRTF, the personalized head related transfer function. And they're going to keep sending me emails with new files to put into the Dolby Atmos Mastering Suite.
Stancy says, what would be a budget headphone for checking these mixes out? I mean, any decent pair of headphones, because binaural, once it's decoded, it then just becomes a straight stereo signal. So the videos that I put on YouTube demonstrating this stuff, they're not going to sound as good as what you would get from the actual device because they've been through YouTube's compression algorithms, but it's just straight stereo. The difference with Apple is that the files they're streaming to the phone, I mean, if you listen to Atmos on an Apple TV and plug that into a sound bar or an actual full surround system, you will get, I think, 7.1.4. The 0.4 is the 4 speakers on the height. So you've got 7 surround speakers. 0.1 is the subwoofer. 4 is in the height information. And so, yeah, you will get an actual full surround decode from that. But if you listen to it on a phone, the phone knows that you've only got earbuds, so it will create a binaural stereo render of that spatialization to give you the best impression you can on headphones. That's what's so clever about the tech. But at that point, it will work on any headphones. It's slightly confusing with Apple because the default setting is auto. And if it's on auto, it'll only enable Atmos if you have a pair of Apple earbuds or the AirPods Pro. Mike, in a minute, I want to know what your opinion is of the AirPods Pro, just out of interest. But that's not a limitation of the binaural. That's just the head tracking thing, which I think is weird and wrong for music. So I have it disabled. Works great for films and things, but doesn't work for me for music. So, for example, what you could do is you could plug one of these into the lightning port on your iPhone, at which point you're getting stereo out of there, and you could plug any headphone jack into there. And you go into the settings on the iPhone and say Atmos always, and then you can plug in any pair of headphones you like. So it works really well on my Sennheiser HD650s. It'll work well on Audeze or anything else. Yes, Mike, how are the AirPods Pro, just out of interest?
The AirPods Pro or the AirPods Max?
Oh, sorry,
the AirPods Pro
Max.
Are these.
Yep.
These are the AirPods Pro.
No,
these
the Max,
are,
the headphones.
Inexpensive and rubbish. The AirPods Max
are right.
Very expensive and also kind of okay. They're really, really overpriced. I have, I'll tell you what. I have so I have Audezes. I have some Audezes in the house and Audezes at work. I have the AirPods Max, the AirPods Pro. I have some Sennheisers. I don't know the model number. And I have these Sonys, and I use these all day. I love them. And that's the W something 1000, some more letters, 4.
Interesting. Okay. So you use
Yeah.
those even though you have Audizies? Is that because the Audizies are heavy, or just?
Yeah, the Odysseys are just too heavy. They sound fantastic, and I do, for like short checking of something, I really enjoy using the Odysseys. Whereas those, but for kind of everyday listening, something you might want to actually keep on, and if you just want to listen to an album for fun, the Sonys are just really nice, and they've got noise cancelling.
Which are the Audizies you've got? LCDX or?
I have the LCD-Xs, and at work, I think it's the LCD MX4s.
Apparently the fives are lighter weight, I think I've heard.
Okay.
I have yet to try a pair of Audisi headphones. I balk, honestly, at the thought of paying thousands of pounds for a pair of headphones.
It's too much money. It is. They're good, but is it, unless you've got money to throw away, or you are actually having to work on headphones. The thing for me is I check things on headphones, but I'm not working on headphones, and so I'm not convinced it's worth spending that kind of money for just checking. If you are working on headphones and you do a lot of stuff on headphones, as some of the other engineers at Metropolis actually do. Tony, for example, does a lot of work on headphones. Then for someone like Tony, it's a no-brainer. He absolutely should be using the best he can afford, in the same way that we would buy the best speakers we can afford.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I think lots of people always ask me this question. So just out of general interest for anybody watching, the Audizies do seem to be becoming do you use EQ with them? Because Nick Watson was saying the EQ response is not entirely flat in the upper mids.
It's not perfect, but it's very good. And I've never heard a pair of headphones that were flat. All headphones I've ever tried have had some kind of tone or sound or curve to them. Usually it's a bit of extra bass. So you just kind of learn in the same way you have to learn a room, you have to learn speakers, you have to learn everything else. They do require a good preamp, which means you've got to spend more money. They're not going to sound great plugged into maybe audio interface. Yeah,
Sam here is saying he heard Andrew Sheps saying that he does 90% of his Atmos work in binaural and the last 10% checking in QC on the speakers. That's interesting to me. That feels like too much time spent. I mean, everybody I know
that makes me cringe.
Everybody I know has said that they spend a lot of time listening to the binaural, so on headphones, and lots of people have said they start in headphones with the binaural. But yes, that sounds risky to me. Having said that, I think he's doing a lot of his mixing full stop in headphones. If what I've heard is correct, ever since he no longer has his studio. So maybe that works for him. I haven't heard anything specifically by him that I can comment on. I don't know about you.
No, I don't know specifically what Atmos mixes he's done, but I mean, his results in the stereo world speak for themselves. He's definitely, he's got quite a few good records under his belt. So I'd be loath to criticize him. But for me, I've tried. I think I've mentioned in the podcast, I've tried doing a mix in Atmos on headphones first, and I ended up deleting the whole thing and starting again. It didn't translate to the room in the way that when I start in the room and then check it on headphones, it translates.
Yeah, no, that's pretty consistent from what people have been telling me as well. Zed Perps says, I wonder when Sonarworks will pop out with an M1 native Atmos suite for headphones with built-in subpack support. Of course, the guys from Subpacks emailed me asking me to try it, and I was like, no, I'm not going to wear what appears to be a combat vest to master with just so that I can. No, but I mean, clearly it works for some people. I thought it was a joke to begin with, honestly, but Anyway, yeah, but you could be right about Sonarworks there. JRel says, why can't there be a separate binaural version and Atmos version? Wouldn't that make the mixing faster? Mike?
I'm not sure doing anything twice would make it faster.
Well, I guess except that, no, yeah, you're probably doing maybe 1.5 times as much work, do you think?
Possibly, I guess, because you would do it would be maybe mostly the same. You'd probably be changing a few EQ things and maybe a little bit of reverb, because the binaural tends to be a bit more reverberant naturally than the room version.
I think, though, perhaps the answer, JRel, is that when you think about it, I mean, there's a real binaural recording, right? I've got my Soundman OKM headphones, binaural mics somewhere. You wear them in your ears, and you get a perfect binaural recording for you because they're in your ears with your head and all the rest of it. So the head-related transfer function is built in. That's one extreme. What Dolby is doing is kind of at the other extreme, where actually the binaural version is entirely fake, emulated, rendered. But you would still have to make all of the same adjustments that you're doing. The advantage is what they're doing is they're supplying one file, because it's not only binaural, it will play in what, Mike? 11.2.
Well, anything. So our room is 11.2.8. It will play on 7.1.2, 5.1 systems, stereo systems. It will just render to whatever you've got. It's not about speakers, it's about coordinates in space.
Yeah, exactly. It's virtual mixing. I like to think of it, JRel, as kind of being unbounced. If you do a stereo mix, you have one file for the left speaker and one file for the right hand speaker. If you do 5.1 mix, you've got 5 for the surround and 1 for the subwoofer. But with an Atmos master, the number of channels is not specified, right? What you have is, I mean, you could have a bed, which is 7.1.2 or whatever that might be, and in that case, those sounds are dedicated to a speaker output. But you could also have, I mean, take a simple example from a movie soundtrack. You could have a helicopter flying around your head. And then in the master file, there's the sound of the helicopter and then instructions to the renderer to make the sound fly around your head. And that is rendered at the point where somebody listens to it. And it'll do the best that it can with whatever speaker configuration you have. And so, as Mike says, as the tech improves and the algorithms improve, potentially you could have a near perfect binaural version of it at some future point. So, I mean, another reason not to do it is that you kind of, if you lock the binaural render into a stereo file, which you could do, that's it. That's how it's going to be forever. Whereas there is the potential for the current renders of Atmos binaural versions to end up sounding even better in future. He says you don't have to wear a sub pack, put it on your chair. Okay, that's good. It's midnight here. I think we've answered most of the questions. I've done quite a bit of stuff on Atmos, so if you guys are interested, please head out and check those resources out. As I say, if you just go to productionadvice.co.uk and search for Atmos, they will pop up in the search engine there. Mike, thank you for being here and answering Atmos specific questions. Sam says Bob Clearmountain mixes stereo and Atmos at the same time, but he's mixing on an SSL and just using DAPs as an Atmos printer, heights as objects. Fascinating for SSL Atmos. Yeah, that's got to be some kind of, I heard an interview with him where he was talking about having a multi-channel compressor built. So he's, quite a lot of his stuff is being bussed, and I don't know whether that goes to a bed in the Atmos mix or, I mean, you
can place objects into kind of fixed locations and use them a bit like a kind of advanced bed, and that is a technique that a lot of engineers are going down. So I imagine that it's some variation in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Or maybe he's doing a bed for the main stuff, and then as the comment there says he's using objects for the height. This is the thing. It's a very flexible system. There are many different ways of using it, many different ways to solve the same problems. many different ways, hopefully to make our music sound better, which is what dynamic range data is all about. So people saying they enjoyed it. I'm glad. Thank you for supporting the event. Please carry on sharing. As I mentioned, the meme activity this year was strong. So please keep sharing those memes. Please keep sharing the videos. Tell your friends, help get the word out. Hopefully in future, we will be able to celebrate even more great sounding dynamic mixes and masters. So as always, thanks for listening.